Well, first of all, I mean, what is Latrodectus? It's basically a loader that has been around now for basically a year or a bit more than a year. And it seems to have some very interesting connections to the famous iced-ID loader, which is in fact just another family that was part of the Endgame, Operation Endgame's takedown. And since then, basically, or maybe even a bit earlier, we have seen that Latrodectus appeared in the threat landscape. We have explicitly called this an evolving loader because we have seen, since it has been around in the wild, a couple of changes, and actually those changes seem to get more and more frequent. But let's first of all focus on some of the key facts that we have seen with Latrodectus. First of all, the delivery chain that is being used by these threat actors for this family seem to be quite constant. So in this case, we have mainly seen some JavaScript files that are going to drop MSI installers, which then are going to finally drop and execute the DLL, which is the core payload of Latrodectus. This, I think, is quite an interesting observation because at least in the current threat landscape, especially since Microsoft blocked the execution of macros per default that are coming from untrusted sources I think it's close to be 2 years ago already, a lot of threat actors started to explore different ways on how to deliver their payloads, right? We see quite a lot of different file types, we see different techniques. And even though within the same threat actor and the same family, those are going to change quite frequent. However, for Latrodectus instead, they usually seem to stick with the same type of delivery for quite some time already. Since a couple of versions back, we have also seen that they adjusted the encryption logic that they have used to encrypt their embedded strings, but we will cover this a bit later. And also due to some recent development, maybe restructuring that they're going through, we have also seen that the C2 endpoint that is being used to contact the C2 server has also started to change. Can you also please, yeah, thank you. That's awesome. So we basically have seen Latrodectus now for a year, and we are monitoring and tracking it for a couple of months now. And we have tried to come up here with a timeline. So the first version of Latrodectus we have seen is from September 2023, which was version 1. And then we basically started to collect all the different versions up until now. And the interesting observation here is that, I mean, now we're talking about 1 year, right? And we have seen quite a lot of different versions already. And the most interesting change, although, is that between version 1.4 and version 1.5, you basically see only a time delay of a bit more than 1 day, right? And again, from version 1.7 and version 1.8, you see like close to 10 days, right? This is quite an interesting observation because usually, I mean, they are building their own malware and then they basically release it, kind of, whatever software vendors are doing as well. But they're also re-releasing it like in a very short amount of time later on, which is an interesting observation, quite unusual from our point of view, but still could also highlight that they maybe made some issues, some mistakes, or wanted to add some improvements that they just came across. So overall, basically, the trend that we see is in the most recent weeks or months, we have seen that the time duration until their releases seems to get shorter and shorter. And of course, as usual in malware families are trying to do, they want to evade sandboxes to avoid being analyzed and so they can operate as stealthy as possible for as long as possible. So for Latrodectus, we have also seen a couple of different evasion techniques, whereas the origin of some of them is not 100% clear to us currently because they are usually not really effective at all. However, the most relevant one that we want to highlight here today is the very first one, which is about the process count check. So essentially, you all know that whenever you're using a real world system, like your notebook, like your corporate device, there are a bunch of processes running on this machine because you usually have Outlook open, you have other processes like Internet Explorer or Chrome, whatever you're going to use, messaging applications, and so forth. So there are quite a bunch of different processes running. Whereas usually in sandbox systems, to analyze these files, there's not really any additional software running because the only goal that we have is we want to analyze the sample, but we don't really want to use this machine, right? So the developers behind Latrodectus added this process count check, which just counts the number of processes that are being running. And whenever it's below a certain threshold, they are just terminating and try to hide their malicious behavior. And of course, thanks to the effort that we're putting into this and the evasion resistance of the VMware platform, this of course is not really a problem because we are running sort of these fake processes in the background to mimic our environment looks as much or as legitimate as possible. So this is not really any kind of problem. Well, as mentioned, there are other checks like MAC address validation. They, of course, checking for debuggers and also if they are basically being executed through the WW64 Windows subsystem. Then when we move on to the next slide, we are going to talk about Latrodectus string encryption or string decryption. So essentially, for a threat analyst, reverse engineer, it's very important to basically understand the internals of a certain malware family. And just by looking into strings, they're already telling you quite a lot of information. Yeah, you probably know maybe some API names that are being present there, maybe some arguments that are used. So strings really indicate already quite a lot on the capabilities of the sample. So it's essential for threat analysts to understand this, but of course it's also very, very important for malware configuration extraction to basically have this plaintext strings. For Latrodectus, we have seen quite a couple of different string encryption implementations that they had. So while they initially started with a simple XOR operation and they just used the pseudo random number generator to seed this basically, they quite shortly replaced this by a rolling XOR where they just used a basic incrementing counter for their seed. And in the most recent version, starting with 1.4, which is a couple of months old now, they basically replaced this whole encryption logic with AES 256. And this was also one of the major changes that we have seen so far in Latrodectus. And this is, of course, still valid to be used up until now.